empresarial porque considero que dentro de todas las ramas de la comunicación, esta es la más humana. Nosotros no nos basamos en ventas, sino nos basamos en comportamientos. Por lo tanto, considero que las acciones que nosotros realizamos como organización siempre deben impactar positivamente en una sociedad.
Creo que es una carrera completa que tiene una mirada netamente corporativa, además que ve todas las partes de las comunicaciones de una manera integral. Por eso considero que comunicación e imagen empresarial es una carrera que en verdad aporta a lo que hoy en día se está buscando en las organizaciones y en el mundo.
Todos los ciclos, la carrera de Comunicación e Imagen Empresarial organiza charlas en donde participan bastantes expositores y empresas que te dan contenido para crecer profesionalmente y también oportunidades laborales.
Buenas tardes, bienvenidos. Mi nombre es Alex Hartley, docente de la UPC. Bienvenidos a una nueva charla ofrecida por nuestra Imagen Week, volumen 8, que tenemos aquí en nuestra carrera de Comunicación e Imagen Empresarial de la universidad. El día de hoy vamos a tener una charla importante, diferente, en 2 idiomas, y para empezar justamente los dejo con nuestra alumna Flavia Zamora, quien es la anfitriona del día de hoy. Adelante, Flavia.
Buenas tardes a todos, mi nombre es Flavia Zamora, soy estudiante de 7º ciclo de la carrera de Comunicación e Imagen Empresarial y quiero darles la bienvenida a todos ustedes a la charla de Interculturalidad y Comunicación Internacional. Para esto contamos con la presencia de 2 invitados, Fernando Ocampo y Ella Heffler, quienes nos van a hablar sobre cómo se gestiona la comunicación de una organización global y el impacto que generan en sus stakeholders. Ahora tengo el agrado de presentar a nuestros invitados de Habitat Humanity International. Y bueno, voy a presentar a Ella Heffler en inglés y voy a hacer la presentación en el mismo idioma. Ella is a Communication Manager for Habitat for Humanity Terwilliger Center for Innovation in Shelter, as a especially non-profit storytelling and brand strategy. She has worked with organizations across numerous social sectors to amplify programming and reach key stakeholders. Throughout her career, Ella has focused on supporting innovative technical teams to communicate their impact more effectively to a wide range of audiences. Prior to communicate their impact, joining Habitat for Humanity International, she worked as a senior partnership officer for the International Rescue Committee's Somalia Country Program, and lead communications and external relations for Build Health International, a global leader with healthcare design. In her spare time, she served as a mentor and alumni board member for Princeton in Africa. Originally from Toronto, Canada, Ella holds a bachelor's degree in history from Jameson College. También nos acompaña Fernando Campo, quien es especialista en sistema de mercado y emprendimiento de Terwilliger Center for Innovation in Shelter, de Habitat for Humanity International. Actualmente lidera proyectos en temas de financiamiento, desarrollo digital y mercadeo. Tiene más de 10 años de experiencia trabajando en proyectos del sector financiero, construcción y campañas políticas. Es bachiller de la carrera de Comunicación e Imagen Empresarial por la UPC, magíster en Gestión Pública por USIM y ha cursado cursos de Cultura, Medición de Clima Laboral, Gamification y de Sustainable Business Strategy en la Business School de Harvard. Thank you so much, Ella. Muchas gracias, Fernando, por acompañarnos el día de hoy y ya pueden empezar. You can start now.
Muchas gracias, Flavia. Voy a comenzar con la presentación. ¿Se ve mi pantalla?
Sí, adelante.
Listo, gracias. Well, thanks for the UPC and the Communication and Image Corporate Career for the opportunity to be talking here about our work. As Flavia tell, I'm Fernando Campo, a specialist market system and entrepreneurship in Habitat for Humanity, the Terwilliger Center for Innovation in Shelter, based here in Lima, Peru. In Habitat Terwilliger Center, we work with a common purpose that each person needs a safe place to call home. With this mission, we work in more than 70 countries around the world. In Peru, we have been working more than 10 years. We are pioneers in creating, designing, and optimizing the financial service with focus all the time in access to housing. In 2012, we introduced the microbill that is bolts of investment in favor to housing microfinancing in all Peru. In 2010, we opened a laboratory here in Peru to articulate the market with commercial alliance promoting innovation in material service, public policy, always with a focus in the segment of the progressive construction, also known as autoconstrucción here in Peru. But this term doesn't not conform to the reality that we know about the market. The progressive housing segment in Peru moved more than $1 billion only in Lima per year, a segment that is not known and full many market stigmas about it, all the people that live in this segment. We have extensive know-how in the market in actor cash and information flow. We know and presented all this information in about all the studies that we make and public in the last few years. We have a complete story mapping about this segment, and we want to reduce the time it takes to the release the dream of housing for a family in the segment C and D of the Peruvian market, which can take more than 30 years now. The TCIS articulate the relationship and pull all our know-how in favor of the project objective. This is how look like our process and a workflow of our project in development, which material suppliers, builders, families, and financial entities. Here we can find the mason or el albañil, maestro de obras, and all that connection that they have, because these masons have all the trust of the family and is like the king of all this process. We use now all our global brand to generate networking and promote the lens in favor of projects in the segment. We want our partners to have a great commercial income benefits, while we generate positive impact in society. All our work all the time is 100% measured. This is so much important for us. In this line, in 2020, we introduced the Guardián Constructor to generate and manage all the damage that we have in the construction single-family homes. We find a gap in the market with a high unmet demand. And with our networking, we have joined an Uber development company, such as Menorca Inversiones, together with the PET, the Peruvian Association of Technical Entities, that works with more than 1,000 builders who have worked in the last year with the Mi Vivienda program, and who they did not have an optimized service to this progressive housing segment. And how strong is this segment? Well, I want to tell you that during the COVID crisis, this segment did not stop anytime and was the only one with positive and growing records during all the months of the pandemic. The GC, Guardián Constructor, is a new model and philosophy of our work. We focus in the single housing families. In this, we use all the cross information with all our partners and all our know-how on field. This is very important for us too. In the coming years, we have to build a new experience in construction for the single family segment, safer, formal, and in a period less than 4 years. Now it's 30 years. This project is a little show of all extensive work in corporate communication, brand message, and at all the levels, internal communication with our partners, political communication to achievement. For example, the Sustainable Development Law approved by the Congress the last year. And a lot, but a really lot of file work. As a graduate of a career in 2014, I know all the wide operation of the career. One of the day we can be in an office in San Isidro or Atlanta. Next day we are presenting a proposal in the Congress for the ministry, and we can finish the week in José Galvez in Villa María del Triunfo, working for Mi Vivienda program, for example. All is a part of the teamwork that we make for the Guardián Constructor in the TCIS Peru. Well, that is the operation in Peru, but how does the same work in the other 69 countries that we have operation in all the world? It's my pleasure to introduce Hela Helfer, the Community Manager of Habitat for Humanity Intercultural Center. Hela is based in Washington. And I'm going to stop sharing my presentation and give the pass to Hela. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Fernando, for introducing us to the Terwilliger Center's work in Peru and for the wonderful transition to kind of expand out and see how that fits with the rest of Habitat's communications. We're going to build from Peru out to speak to the 70 countries and then come back in to focus again on the Terwilliger Center's work specifically. And with the remaining time before we go to questions, I want to look first at the Habitat brand and then how a department like the Terwilliger Center fits into that, and how Fernando's work that he's just described fits into the Terwilliger Center. We're going to talk about some of the challenges and opportunities that come with working for a big international nonprofit organization, and some of the ways that as people in communications, we can leverage the global brand and find opportunities for national and sector specific. So Fernando also opened his presentation with a focus on our mission. And I think that that's super critical because in everything that we do, we have to come back to this goal. It's what makes Habitat unique. It's the center of our work as a nonprofit. And all of those 70 countries and many, many teams working in them have this focus that we build strength, stability, and self-reliance through shelter. No matter if that is through the market system, as Fernando described, with programs like Guardian Constructor and the incremental self-built construction market, or in the US, where Habitat is building whole homes with teams of volunteers, or installing a water pump in a community in Canada. All of those programs share this commitment. And as communications professionals, it's really important that this underscores all of the efforts that we have to support the brand. And so in this common mission, we're strongest when we have one voice and we speak from that unified brand strategy. And Habitat is unique because we've been doing this work for more than 40 years and all over the world. So we have a really strong brand voice and a really strong and well-recognized logo around the world already. Not every organization that you will join will have that. It might be part of your responsibility to help the organization develop that. But in all of your communications, it'll be important that you come back to this. And for Habitat, that's four key values. And brand, and why I wanted to start with brand here, is really important for all aspects of the work, but it's also important particularly for cause marketing. Habitat for Humanity does a lot of partnerships with corporations, and having a strong unified brand is really important to tell funders and corporations who they're working with and how they're aligning their mission to ours. And with specific programs like the Terwilliger Centers and programs like Guardian Constructor, where we're working with technical partners, it's also really important for them to understand who they're aligning with so that we have that shared value that Fernando mentioned. And they can know that we bring value to that partnership as well. So in all of our communications, we're building upon this strong brand foundation. In focus groups and outreach to our key stakeholders, as Habitat worked to strengthen this brand, many people identified the idea that a Habitat home is a really strong foundation for a family and offers an opportunity for them to build a better life for themselves. And that's a very tangible idea that we try to bring into our communications so that there is something for all of our audiences to relate to. So, zooming out a little bit, what does 70 countries look like? This is the geographic scope of Habitat for Humanity's work. And as you can see, it covers a lot of territory. In Peru, all of Habitat for Humanity International's work goes through the Terwilliger Center as the leaders. But in other countries, there is often a national organization working on traditional programming and also a Terwilliger Center team working on market development. There might be programs for microfinance in the same country that there's home construction, in the same country that there's water and disaster response programs. Because we have such a big geography, we also have a really unique structure to our communications team. And I think understanding the structure of the communications team that you'll be joining is really important because it influences significantly the workflows and the responsibilities that you may have as communications professionals entering the space. So I just want to flag the different colors on this map as a reminder, but we're going to come back to the structure in a second. First, I want to dive a little bit into the visual identity of Habitat's work, because I think it's helpful to nuance how the Terwilliger Center, as one technical department focused on market systems, fits into Habitat's overall brand, which focuses on housing writ large and puts families at the center. So creative collateral like photography and videography, but also graphic design is really important because it's a tangible expression of how we present our brand and our messages. All of these photos are of Habitat families that have been supported by our work. And these photos represent that our brand, we put families first. And often, as you'll see in these photos, we're featuring families in the context of their home. So there is that alignment. When you look at these families, if you didn't see the homes in the background, they could all be in the US, or they could be in any number of countries. You know, other than their clothes, their color of their skin, and their house, they're all the same visual type of collateral. And they send the same unified message of strength, stability, and happiness. But that's not necessarily true for all parts of our programs. With the families who are at the center, we're trying to reach them with all of our programs. But the way we do that looks different. So in construction, for example, in the US, the model is that we have volunteers building whole homes alongside the families that are putting in sweat equity. Internationally, construction looks different, the techniques look different, and in order for us to have credibility with our audiences, we need to reflect that. Especially for the Terwilliger Center that's working through market-based approaches with technical teams, it's really important that we're picking images and we're picking visual collateral that fits with the messages we're trying to send. So all of these on both sides are Habitat images. You can see how the brand gets projected through what we choose to document and how we choose to present ourselves, be it in annual reports or in social media. But within that space, within that guiding framework of the brand, as communications professionals supporting a technical team, we're making very specific decisions in order to position our programs in a way that lends them credibility. So that communication structure I talked about. At Habitat, because we're such a large organization, there are multiple layers to our communication structure. At HQ, which is based in the US, we have a large communications team that is broken into a number of specialist functions. Most of these are intuitive, but on digital and storytelling team, you have the website, including both the pages and the structure of the physical, of the digital architecture, but also the large storytelling and blog section where we can feature impact stories. Also the annual report. Habitat has a print magazine that is distributed to more than 1 million families every 4 months. And they produce that with impact stories as well, as well as newsletters and social media. Then on the external and media relations team, we have media engagement, including pitching and placing op-eds, celebrity engagement, including some big stars from television and movies, thought leadership, and executive communications. And finally, on the donor communication side, we have reporting, partnerships, and also cross-marketing. So with each of these teams, they have a specialist function. In order to make sure that our communications is targeted to the geographies that we're working with, we also have regional communications teams that make up an international communication structure. Those teams are based in Costa Rica, in Europe, and in Manila in the Philippines. And those teams are more generalists. They provide all of these functions to the national organizations and to the nationally based teams, but then they also funnel up into the HQ structure. So for the global structure, you have the benefit of an international team that is a specialist in the market and in the media of your region, but also the full weight of the Habitat brand and the structure that's based in HQ, the resources and the contacts and the platforms that they run. And then you have teams like myself and Fernando that sit on specific programs. And that helps Habitat's communications also drill down to some of those really specific technical audiences and really support the program's work. And having this structure is important because communications really exists in this context to amplify the program's impact and help reach additional supporters. And it's important that we are doing that in a targeted way that speaks to those specific audiences. What I wanted to highlight for you is that if you go to work for an organization like Habitat for Humanity, you might find yourself in any one of these roles. There are more than 70 communications professionals at Habitat for Humanity in the international network. And depending on if you're interested in graphic design, if you're interested in storytelling, if you're an expert in media relations, you'll want to plug into the part of the structure that best aligns with those skills. For me, as was mentioned in my bio, I'm really interested in how we can tell technical program stories and make them accessible to general audiences and really support programs directly in that way. And that's why I found myself gravitating to the technical team with the tour. So now that you've seen our structure a little bit and you've heard that we have over 70 staff members working on communications at all levels, I just want to give you a sense of the strength of that brand and why it's so important that we align with it. Habitat.org, the main Habitat for Humanity website, receives almost 500,000 page views per month. In earned media, we're getting 10,000 media mentions on average per month. And currently we have a social media following over 2 million across all of those channels. And this is the aggregate. So on social media, there will be social media accounts for the main Habitat channels. You know, the main Habitat Twitter that's run by that HQ team has 1 million followers on Twitter. The main Facebook page has 700,000 followers. But then there are also regional channels, just like that structure, where the regions have specific channels, and they can post in the languages for that region and reach a regional audience. And then the Terwilliger Center also has a channel. But because of the size of this reach, when we get into talking about platforms a little bit, it's really important that we think about the audiences and we tap into these platforms because the Terwilliger Center's reach on its own is only a small part of what Habitat for Humanity International is able to reach and access in terms of audiences and in terms of promoting our programs and our impacts. So that's where we're going next. As Fernando explained, the Terwilliger Center for Innovation and Shelter works with housing market actors to expand innovative and client-responsive products, services, and financing so that households can improve their shelter more effectively and efficiently. Our goal is to make housing markets work more efficiently for people in need of decent and affordable housing so that they can improve their quality of life and their shelter themselves. It's a different model from the rest of Habitat, and it takes unique messages, unique audiences, and unique platforms in order to reach our goals. We're going to dive into some specific examples towards the end, but first I want to take you through some of the core parts of our Terwilliger Center specific communication strategy, and so you can see how it fits into the brand that we've just explored with Habitat. So, our communications objectives. These fit into the objectives of Habitat for Humanity overall, but it's really important that because we have different audiences and different way of doing our programs, that we're being targeted with our objectives as well. And every piece of collateral and every project that we undertake as communications professionals, we want to funnel into a very clear objective. These are three of the kind of overarching core objectives, but of course, Fernando has unique objectives, particularly for Peru and that specific market. So one is to build credibility with donors and create opportunities for them to engage with our work. We also want to show how donors have supported our work, but in order for them to support it and want to support it, they first have to see how they can fit within it. And so it's not just about stewardship, it's also about creating that space for them to see themselves represented in the issues that we work on and the ways that we do that work. Next, because the Terwilliger Center is so technical in its focus and working with those market system actors, it's really important that we're engaging those actors and positioning ourselves as a subject matter expert and a technical partner for those market systems actors. We need to work with them and through them and uplift them in order for our programs to be effective. And so this is one of the objectives where communications and programs really need to come together closely and seamlessly in order to strengthen each other. And the final one is to influence the civil society and the private sector to invest in the role of the market. This is really important to the overall goals of the Terwilliger Center, which I mentioned are to make markets more effective. And communications is a really powerful way to do that. So overall, with our goals, we're trying to build credibility, we're trying to build opportunity, and we're trying to build influence in all of the work that we do, whether it's promotional or whether it's directly related to programs. So let's talk about audiences. All of the audiences map to those key objectives. And I'm sure you've seen this with every organization that you have looked at and have studied. It's really important that you can connect your objectives to specific audiences because not every audience cares about your work, and you won't care about every audience because we simply can't do effective communications if we are not being targeted and who we're going to reach. These are 5 key categories, but even these categories are too big for what we look at. So donors means a lot of things. At Habitat, a lot of the general communications are targeted at individual donors, and they're also targeted at corporate donors for things like marketing. For the Terwilliger Center, donors specifically means development finance corporations and institutional donors, foundations, corporations, and bilateral and multilateral organizations who are often more technical. It means less individual giving. And so there are those specific types of donors that we're targeting when we're doing communications. Implementing partners. As you saw above in the objectives, one of our core goals is to reach more partners and to engage them in our work. For the Terwilliger Center, implementing partners means financial institutions, material suppliers, vocational institutions, impact investors, and more. They need to see their work reflected in our communications so that they know that we would be a good partner for them and that they're more willing to come on board. Thought partners. The Terwilliger Center's work is really grounded in market research and in data. It's a huge part of how we seek to influence the housing sector and how we seek to inform policymakers about what would be effective to better support the low-income housing sector. Therefore, we're also trying to reach research institutions, academics, industry conveners, and these audiences are really key for us, not just to advance those programs, but also to build credibility, because we value being a team that cares about being data-driven and cares about being grounded in that research. Investees. These are a different type of partner for us. As you'll hear in the examples to come, Habitat also has programs where we invest directly in startups, and also we loan capital to microfinance institutions like Fernando mentioned with microbuild. And so it's really important that these types of partners know that we have services and see us as credible partners to support them. This, there's a lot of overlap between implementing partners and investees for us because we're working with that private sector. And then finally, the general public. This goes without saying, but it's really important that even as a technical part of Habitat for Humanity and technical organization working with the market, we still are putting out accessible messages. This is key for brand alignment, so we can stay strong to that global brand and continue to build credibility. And it's also really important because we put out a lot of communications on the main Habitat for Humanity channels. And when we do, we can tap into those very significant audience reach that we just talked about. But a lot of those platforms, and we'll talk about platforms next, a lot of them have a general audience in mind. That's part of how we've been able to reach so many people. And so it's important that the Terwilliger Center's communications can hit at both of these levels in order to tap into the global network and build credibility and reinforce the other goals that we have. So channels. It should be clear by now that we're kind of narrowing in. We also want the audiences to map specifically to these channels. And these include those big Habitat for Humanity international audiences that I mentioned, like Habitat.org. For the Terwilliger Center, we care about all of these. We leverage all of these, and we are trying to balance which audience we're trying to reach with where they are getting their information from. So when we're looking at technical audiences like microfinance institutions and investors with impact investment, are they reading Twitter? Are they reading LinkedIn? Are they reading Instagram? They're probably more likely to be on LinkedIn or Twitter than they are on Instagram to find out about it. Same goes, they're probably more likely to be reading Crunchbase News or another earned media site than they are to be reading Habitat's website with the storytelling section. And so if we're going to put in the time and effort to develop a strong impact story, we want to place that on the channel that is going to be aligned best. And that doesn't mean that we don't use multiple channels. But every time, and you'll see this in the examples, every time that we are moving a piece of content or collateral to a new channel, we need to scale it and adjust it to target the audience of that platform. And so if something is written originally as a press release and we want to do a series of tweets about it, we're going to scale the language, we're going to scale the tone to be appropriate to the audience that we have on social media. We're not just going to take verbatim clips out of the press release, which is written perhaps for a more technical audience, and put it directly onto those channels, for example. And so we also care more about some of these channels than perhaps other parts of Habitat do. We care about earned media, technical blogs, research publications, and social media, because those are where our audiences, our more technical audiences, like those thought partners and those implementing partners. That's where they're getting their information from. And so as we move into a couple of case studies that bring these together, I want you to kind of keep in mind the channels that are being highlighted in this work, but also how it maps to some of those audiences. So first, we have an example from the Shelter Venture Fund. And the Shelter Venture Fund is Habitat's impact investment vehicle, which means that we are making actual financial investments in early stage startups in order to help them scale their work. And so Habitat for Humanity, through the Terwilliger Center, has invested $3 million US in 11 startups to date. The Shelter Venture Fund launched in 2018. And so it's still just getting going. But this is really important to that brand and that mission, because we need to bring more products and more innovative services to those families. And so I want to take you through one piece of collateral that we did recently for the Shelter Venture Fund, which was announcing a new investment. And so just last week, the Terwilliger Center announced a new investment in Tavasta Manufacturing Solutions, which is a 3D printing startup out of India. And Tavasta was previously a participant in another one of the Terwilliger Center's programs called Shelter Tech. Shelter Tech is a platform that supports startups to scale up their business, and it connects them with capital, it connects them with mentorship, and it connects them with technical expertise through accelerators, but also through our global platform. And Fernando can probably tell you more during questions about how that's happening in Peru. But Tavasta was part of the India startup Shelter Tech Accelerator in 2018. And now Habitat was preparing to make an announcement about a $400,000 investment in the company. And so because we knew that our best tool in this case would be to generate media outreach and reach some of those technical audiences, we wanted to be talking to other impact investors. We wanted to be talking to other innovators and folks in this startup space. We were really targeting those newsrooms to help us reach those audiences that might not be on our direct platforms ourselves, might not already be on our social media. But of course, we want to bring them back into that space. So we start with a press release on Habitat's main international newsroom site. We also put this out to India media specifically and the Asia Pacific media. This generated hundreds of media hits for us, particularly in targeted outlets in India and also in those niche sector publications that we were trying to reach. It's not enough when you're writing a press release like this just to announce a big investment. And it really needs to tie into what the sector is doing as well. And so in our press release, which is only part of it is on the screen here, but you can find it on the website, we really tied into the narrative of 3D printing that is happening in the sector to make it clear why Tavasta is so unique. Most of the conversation about 3D printing has focused on the US and Europe and very high income countries. And Tavasta and this investment are helping to demonstrate that there's also an opportunity in emerging markets. And so that's a newsworthy hook that we grounded our press release in, so that there were stories for the media to report and pick up on. And so tailoring that release is also really important. one more thing about Tavasta before we move on to the microbuild fund. This is just what we did most recently with them. But because they've been part of our portfolio for a couple of years now, we've had other opportunities to feature their work. We previously featured the first 3D printed home that they built in Chennai. We featured that on the website, and we featured it in our print magazine called Habitat Magazine. And those were good. That story was a good fit for those outlets because it had really strong visuals with the 3D printing and with the home, and it had really good storytelling from the film. The home was actually inaugurated by the Minister of Finance for India, and so that gave it kind of a newsworthiness hook as well. With that inauguration, it was another opportunity for us to pitch to media. When we were doing this press release, one of the factors that comes in with international communications is not just communicating across borders and across geographies within that habitat organizational structure, but also with all the partners that you are working with. And so cross-cultural communications is really important. It's really important to work with colleagues that understand the norms and expectations of the outlets that you're working in each country and geography. That's why we had one Habitat press release, but we also reviewed it with our colleagues in Habitat India to ensure that it would be appropriate to the market there. And one of the things that changed between the US market and the India market in order to find a good balance is that in the US market, it would be a lot more normal to announce the full investment amount and for the startups to have all of that information very public because that's the way that the investment structure works here. But taking the lead from the Tavasta team, we framed our press release to focus to only identify the amount of the habitat investment because it was different from the norms in India. And so having that open, clear communication internally, where you can ask questions of the partners and ensure that everybody is bought in, is really important. And that then allows you to do much more aligned promotion and dissemination with your partners because you have something to get behind. So looking at an example from the microbuild fund. And as Fernando mentioned, the microbuild fund is an investment vehicle that the Terwilliger Center runs, which invests capital in microfinance institutions to enable them to be able to develop more targeted housing finance products. And so for many low-income families, they're not able to get a traditional mortgage in order to build or improve their home because they don't have either sufficient income or the documentation that those banks require in order to secure the traditional mortgage loan. So microfinance is a really important market investment tool for us in order to increase access to capital for those low-income families. The microbuild fund, however, is unique in that it is a separate entity that Habitat has a majority stake in, but it has its own board of directors and its own structure that means that there's even more stakeholders that we're responsible for communicating to. And so as such, the microbuild fund has its own annual report that goes out every year because there are stakeholders that are expecting that report out. So Habitat for Humanity International has an annual report that comes out annually, like every nonprofit. And the Terwilliger Center is part of that annual report, but we also help produce this microbuild fund annual report. And I wanted to flag this example because I think it's a strong example of technical communications that can also be accessible. There are very specific goals that come with producing an annual report and reporting out to those stakeholders. But in these 3 sample pages of the document, you see Habitat's brand colors and style represented, our same visual identity for those photos that is consistent across what we looked at earlier. And in this spotlight on microfinance institutions, you have a technical story about a housing microfinance institution that is lending capital in ways that can be really technical, but because it's grounded in the story of families, like you can see in the middle page, it becomes accessible both to those technical audiences and to the general audiences that we want to reach. And when we're aligned with the brand in that way, we can also put the content out across a variety of platforms. And so earlier when I was mentioning that we need to scale to our audience, social media is one of the ways that we do that. And so we have 2 different examples of those different platforms that I was mentioning on social media. On the left, the Terwilliger Center's Twitter takes a much more technical tone and is really trying to reach those technical audiences that I mentioned. And they're much more likely to follow the Terwilliger Center's work because we're doing specific outreach to them than Habitat overall. And we often retweet the aspects of Habitat's general feed that will be most valuable to our key audience so that we can amplify them. But when the last microbuild annual report came out, of course, we weren't just going to put out an annual report. You have to also leverage all of the other communications tools for dissemination. So we looked at how can we take some of the stories from the annual report and also rework them into stories that fit with the tone, the style, and the length constraints of stories that go on habitat.org or stories that go in Habitat magazine. We looked at how do we use our newsletter as well as technical newsletters of our partners and of the networks that we belong to in order to disseminate links out to this report. And we looked at how do we represent this on social media. So on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, you can see an example from the Terwilliger Center's Twitter. The Development Finance Corporation, DFC, is one of the major donors to the Microbuild Fund. They are a US government body. And when they were celebrating International Women's Month, about a month after our annual report came out, we had an opportunity to amplify their message and align the work that they had supported us in doing with that message. And so we had a set of specific engagements where we were trying to align with this donor as well as this key international theme day. And you can see that the tweet is more focused on numbers and a little bit more technical in nature, which reflects the platform of the Terwilliger Center's partners. On the right-hand side with habitat.org, we also leverage that platform with 1 million Twitter followers in order to get the report out to more general audiences. Now, it may not be that every audience or every follower wants to click through an annual report, but the content of that translated into bite-sized pieces still gives them a sense of this as a key area that Habitat is working on and a key piece of our portfolio. And so the team that runs the main Habitat social media account, they framed those tweets in a less technical way in order to reach that audience. They focused on the families that were featured within the report and visuals that kind of communicate the impact of the program without diving so deep into all of the numbers. And then finally, I want to focus the last case study on a ladder up report, which is a new report that the Terwilliger Center just put out earlier this month. It was released on World Habitat Day, and it's a technical market study, looks at 9 countries globally and examines the role that the construction sector has, and in particular the residential construction sector, has in national GDP and also recovery efforts from the pandemic. And this report was building on a report that we released last October called The Cornerstone of Recovery, which looked at the role of the housing market overall in helping governments to recover from the pandemic, and how we could address the global housing deficit and address the challenges brought on by COVID-19 together in more efficient ways. And so when we released the Ladder Up report, we timed it to go out on World Habitat Day, because the theme and focus of World Habitat Day being on cities and on urban development was really key to the findings of this report. It would bring additional eyes to what we were doing. As I mentioned, one of the key channels for the Terwilliger Center is this research and ensuring that all of the products that we put out align with that brand. And it's a space that the Terwilliger Center engages in that's less prominent in the rest of Habitat's programs. So this report went live on Habitat's website, but it went live alongside a full dissemination strategy that leveraged the rest of our platforms and channels. And so one of the ways we did that is through an op-ed written by the CEO of Habitat for Humanity, Jonathan Beckford. And by disseminating the report in this accessible way through the voice of our CEO, we were able to not only reach the audiences of Reuters, but also translate the content and make it meaningful to a wider range of audiences. And I think this is a really important piece of international communications and nonprofit communications, is that it's important to think not only about your organization's brand, but also your thought leaders and their individual brands. Each of the executives at the companies that you'll work on has a unique voice. They have specific issues and expertise that they care about. And when you can align their expertise and their voice with the programs that you implement, you can have a much bigger impact and a much more authentic impact. And so in producing this piece, we worked closely with the thought leadership team at that HQ level, and also with Jonathan and his team, to make sure that we were pulling out the aspects of the report that he cared most about and that would resonate with the audiences that he reaches as he speaks. And so we grounded this op-ed in the story of one Mason based out of India, and how he had been able to build his business and his work, starting from a day laborer all the way up to running a full team, and how the construction sector was that ladder up for him to be able to improve his livelihood, while also helping the families in his community gain access to better housing. And by telling the story by grounding the opening of the op-ed in his story, we were able to give an accessible hook to the technical research of this report. We also put out press releases for each of the countries that were featured in the data that the report used, including Peru. And so that enabled each of the national media teams to do outreach to the outlets that corresponded with their area and tell a specific part of the story, and share specific findings that would be relevant to citizens, but also the governments, the decision makers, the policy makers, the corporations for that country. And that helps us really connect with the technical sectors in each region, and also with those key policy makers and decision makers. And so in this case, we started with a communications product, but in order to do that dissemination, we really needed to think about, well, not just who are the audiences for this report? Who do we want this report to get to? We wanted the report to get to policymakers. We wanted the report to get to technical leads in the sector, in the construction sector. And we also wanted to do that general audience information in order to kind of strengthen that overall. And so a big part of it was finding out where those audiences sit. And then again, when we do social media, one thing that was unique about this opportunity, because it was a truly global report, is that we were able to tap not only into the HFHI social media accounts and those regional social media accounts, but also the country level social media accounts. And so in aligning it with World Habitat Day, we developed and shared messages and starter posts for all of the national organizations to post, not just from those 9 countries that are represented in the report, but also from the full 70 countries that are within the habitat. Because the themes that are in the report are meaningful to all countries, especially those in the low and middle income sectors. And we were able to position the report in a way that demonstrated that connection to them, even if they didn't see their country name in the list of specific countries that pulled them. So, of course, we developed social media graphics alongside those messages that fit with that visual identity. But one of the most rewarding parts of working on this project was getting to see those messages and tweets and posts come in from every continent, and to get to connect in that way with each of the communications teams that were behind us amplifying this work and this research. And this is just a small sample of them, but it was personally very cool on World Habitat Day to have this be part of the experience, and also to see how particular organizations chose to amplify it in their own way. So on the right-hand side with Habitat Philippines, they had posted some of our graphics, but they also worked with the Terwilliger Center team in the Philippines to develop a whole event that helped launch this report. And so we were also able to work with them on developing events and using this live stream platform that we've all become so accustomed to really reach those policymakers in the Philippines. And so we didn't really talk about events as part of this presentation, but perhaps if there's questions, we can take those. And just to flag that it's another one of these tools that we're leveraging, and the decision to do an event always ties back to who that audience is that you're trying to reach and where they can best get information. So that takes us to the end of my part of the presentation, and just much gratitude for the opportunity to share with Fernando both about our work in Peru.
Yes, thank you so much, Ellen and Fernando, for being here today. So now we have some questions. I don't know if Fernando quieres agregar algo más de la presentación en español.
Okay, I'm going to talk in Spanish now. ¿Me escuchan bien?
Sí.
Ya. Gracias a todos por darnos la oportunidad, como decía Ela, de poder compartir un poco del trabajo que realizamos en el Territory Leader a favor de la vivienda. Ya para agregar algunos temas puntuales de comunicación pura y dura que realizamos aquí, uno tiene que ser siempre consciente y muy capaz de poder realizar mucho trabajo en equipo. Eso es parte de lo que los comunicadores hacemos en todo momento. Por ejemplo, el trabajo que hemos estado presentando, tal cual mencionaba él, es el resultado del trabajo de un equipo que suele ser multidisciplinario y en el que, por ejemplo, la operación acá en Perú nos acompaña también un exalumno de la misma carrera. Yo soy de la carrera de 2014 y también Rodrigo Baré, que nos apoya en temas de comunicación. Eso también nos habla bastante de lo importante que es no solo trabajar en comunicación e imagen, sino vivirlo, porque la imagen que nosotros proyectamos es muy importante, inclusive cuando eres alumno, porque puede ser de que en algún otro momento, algún otro exalumno de años atrás pueda llamar a la carrera y pedir referencias porque está buscando hacer equipo. Otro tema bastante importante también en la comunicación ya a nivel general es la presencia del líder. En el caso nuestro, Gema Estrático es la country lead. ¿Y por qué menciono esto cuando hablo de comunicación? Es porque, como veíamos al inicio en el video que presentaron, el chico que hablaba decía que nosotros trabajamos generando relaciones, trabajamos gestionando confianza, y eso es algo muy importante, porque parte de esta confianza, las maniobras que nosotros vamos a realizar en la comunicación. Entonces, la parte más difícil que tiene toda estrategia, siempre en cualquier operación, es la claridad, y la parte más compleja es sostener esa misma estrategia en el tiempo. Y eso solo lo puedes hacer si es que tienes la confianza y claridad de tu líder. Eso no hay estrategia que pueda sostenerse si es que el líder no es claro. Nosotros, por ejemplo, tenemos la suerte de que no solo contamos con esa claridad por parte de nuestro country lead, sino que también sabe presentar, sabe hablar, sabe exponerse, y eso es muy importante, porque en el modelo DIRCOM en el que nosotros hemos sido formados, es muy importante la presencia del CEO. El CEO es la empresa, y eso no va a cambiar mañana. Puede haber un logo, podemos tener muchísimos mensajes de marca, pero es siempre la presencia del líder quien respalda la operación. Y ahí les comento que siempre no es solo también un tema de los mensajes que nosotros vamos a emitir, sino detrás de cada acción hay un mapa de stakeholders completo, un monitoreo y seguimiento de información, de noticias. Nosotros somos quienes proveemos, como DIRCOMs, a toda la operación, la información de las personas, de los actores, de las empresas, del mercado. En las conversaciones de equipo, nosotros siempre tenemos que llevar esa batuta, esa información, que es parte de nuestro rol. Eso es ser un DIRCOM. Proveemos de toda esta información a la operación para hacer viables los objetivos que tenemos. Sí, tenemos objetivos de comunicaciones propios, ¿no? Indicadores, alcances, KPIs, bueno, miles que siempre tienen que ser medidos, pero nuestro principal éxito es el relacionado a la operación y no debemos nunca perder ese foco. Y bueno, solo por último, decirles de que si hoy podrían ser comunicadores que están iniciando sus carreras, quizás como practicantes, analistas, algunos pueden ser especialistas, lo que fuese, yo siempre los voy a invitar a esto último que les mencionaba sobre la información. Nosotros podemos y sabemos de que el tiempo pone las cosas en su lugar, y si en algún momento sienten de que en la empresa en donde están no entienden por qué un practicante de imagen lee todos los periódicos del día, sabe mucho sobre temas de política o economía, sabe mucho sobre el sector. Inclusive vas a tener algunos momentos en los que tus propios compañeros te pueden decir, oye, pero tú estás aquí solo para tomar fotos, porque eso puede ser el inicio de nuestra carrera. Hacemos volantes, sí, hacemos murales, claro, tomamos fotos, excelente, pero también sabemos bastante de estrategia, y el tiempo siempre se encarga de poner todo en su lugar. Y es el tiempo también el que está poniendo la figura nuestra del DIRCOM no solo como una herramienta táctica, sino en el directorio mismo, porque somos alguien que puede trabajar muy bien en el campo, somos 4x4, estamos un día hablando, exponiendo junto con nuestro CEO alguna presentación para el Congreso, otro día estamos fuera del país realizando una conferencia, y también estamos trabajando con comunidades y vecinos de zonas periféricas de un país. Entonces, toda esa capacidad 4x4 es la que a nosotros nos diferencia como comunicadores. El tiempo nos está poniendo cada vez más cerca de los directorios, cada vez más relevante nuestra posición desde la estrategia. Eso es algo principal y siempre basados en la confianza. Esa es una pequeña reflexión sobre que agrupa todo el trabajo que venimos realizando específicamente en Perú.
Muchas gracias, Fernando. Sí, totalmente. Yo como estudiante de la carrera, aún en proceso, espero llegar a ser tan grande como ustedes algún día con todas estas experiencias que nos contaron. Entonces, ahora vamos a pasar a la ronda de preguntas. Tenemos aquí alguna que es de María Fernanda Prada. Bueno, ella nos dice, how do you manage the taxes between countries of the donations? Tal vez, ¿cómo manejan los impuestos entre los países?
I can start on that, Fernando. If there's anything you want to add that's unique to Peru, please. I will say that this is one thing that's going to be one outside of the full scope of communications, but also different likely between different organizations. And so for Habitat for Humanity International, because we have what's called a federated structure for our nonprofit, we have both a US entity that provides a global structure, and we have locally registered organizations. And so for the donations, it definitely depends whether it's coming in through that US structure or through the national organizations. And each country has their own laws to manage whether you need to be domestically registered or not. When that translates to us for communications for stewardship, we want to know where our donations are coming in from. We want to know whether their programs are being supported by local donors or by international donors. And one piece of communications that we didn't get into today is that donor communications side. And that donor communications team is developing collateral that goes specifically to those individual donors. The Terwilliger Center comparatively has fewer individual donors because of the nature of our programs, but we still care about all of those donors that are given to us. And we want to make sure that from a communications standpoint, we're stewarding them wherever they're coming from.
Okay, perfect. So we have another question here. Bueno, está en español. Dado el tamaño de la organización, ¿qué es para ti lo más difícil de manejar en términos globales, en términos de comunicación global?
Yo respondo a esa pregunta. Desde la central, GELA, lo que hace a nivel global es respetar. Entonces, ¿cuál es la forma en la que nosotros lo manejamos todo en base al respeto y a la empatía? Porque tenemos un mensaje de marca a nivel global que es aterrizado por cada una de las operaciones en los 70 países en el mundo en los que operamos y se respeta mucho la realidad de cada uno de los mercados. Puede ser, por ejemplo, de que en Estados Unidos el principal foco de las operaciones locales sean el movimiento de voluntarios. Pero por la realidad de otras latitudes como la peruana, aquí el movimiento de voluntarios en base a la mano de obra es muy accesible. Lo difícil es los productos ad hoc, la tecnología. En Estados Unidos puedes irte a un Costco y comprar una casa completa lista para armar. Aquí no. Entonces, ¿cómo alineamos eso? Muy sencillo, respetando y siendo empáticos en que existe un lineamiento general y lo que hace la central es verificar de que siempre los mensajes estén alineados, respetando todas las idiosincrasias y sabiendo de que hay un contexto completamente diferente. Ese respeto, empatía y apertura es lo que nos ayuda a poder, como el Terwil Leader Center, manejar la operación en tantos países y que cada presentación, cada mensaje, cada tweet que se lance, siempre te diga, ah, eso es del Terwil Leader, eso es de Habitat. Así es como lo manejamos.
Gracias. Antes de continuar con la siguiente pregunta, vamos a compartir en este momento una encuesta para nuestros participantes, para que en este momento la puedan ir llenando mientras continúa la ronda de preguntas. Y que en este momento los compañeros la van a compartir y mientras seguimos con las siguientes. Adelante, Flavio.
Ok, acá hay una pregunta que dice, ¿alguna vez han tenido una crisis de comunicación grande que afectó la reputación y cómo lo manejaron? Maybe I can translate the question also. Have Habitat ever gone through a communication crisis that affected its reputation, and how did you handle it?
So I'll answer generally if there's anything for you as well, Fernando. I think it's every organization is going to go through crises at different times. I think it's also really important to consider the distinctions between a crisis that is specifically related to your organization and a crisis that is maybe related to the sector or is a challenge that others are going through, but you find yourself in proximity to. And those need to be handled in very different ways. And so over Habitat's history, we've definitely experienced different flows. And when you're speaking to media as a media spokesperson, you want to know and have agreed with the leadership team and with your coworkers, what is our position on this? Because you want to speak from that brand voice. And those are situations when the media is not necessarily going to be coming with the same narrative that you would want to communicate. And that's kind of when you are being reported on for your internal structure. And as an organization, as a nonprofit organization whose focus is on helping the most vulnerable, we always want the reporting on us to really be focused on those families, right? We don't want the story to be about Habitat's internal structure. We want it to be about the families that we're reaching and the needs that they have and how our partners, how governments can help us in that mission to reach those needs. And in the other case, when there are crises that are not necessarily specific to a scandal, types of scandals that nonprofits generally go through can relate to donations, can relate to leadership. Sometimes the crises might actually be something that nobody else recognizes. I think in the communications team, because we do a lot to make sure that we are communicating a consistent message, sometimes we have these moments of crises before it actually gets out. So for example, when you're working with a partner, you may have a disagreement about how to write that press release. And you want to handle that with them directly before you send out two different press releases that send two different messages and have that crisis escalate to something that is visible and does send a conflicting message. And so I would say one of the ways that we try to handle crises on the international scale is to be proactive about it. It's also to have media training for all of our key spokespeople and all of our senior leaders. So if they get questions that come up and are surprising, they're prepared to answer something and not escalate it. And so I would say for you entering the communication space, taking advantage of those resources that your organization offers for crisis communications, for media training is really valuable, but also recognizing your position within that structure is important. And so in my position, because I support such a broad range of programs, I'm not frequently speaking directly to media. I'm much more likely to be supporting a senior leader or a subject matter expert to do that conversation. And so it's really important that I help them be fulfilled, but I wouldn't necessarily do it them. So that might look different for Fernando, who is interfacing directly with that Peruvian market, much more closely. And I think it's also important to remember that what feels like a crisis at one part of the organization, because it's such a big organization, it can be scaled throughout. And that also means that when you're managing those problems, you might contain it to the country level, or you might need to then escalate it up to the leadership of the structure.
Thank you, Ella. So here's another question from Natalia Candelaria. She asked, when Project Guardián Constructor in Peru was introduced, which was one of the biggest challenges that the organization faced?
Tuvimos muchos retos, de hecho lo seguimos teniendo, es una operación viva que está en curso. El Guardián Constructor es esta filosofía y cuando nosotros hemos empezado a comunicarla, comenzamos a dejar algo en claro desde la comunicación y la operación misma. No podíamos tener una campaña que no se vea reflejada en el campo. Por más bonita que fuese la campaña de mensajes digitales en redes sociales, siempre tenía que ir y tiene que ir con el respaldo de una operación sólida. Ese es el primer reto que teníamos, además de que no es que todo el día las personas estén pensando en que quieren construir una casa nueva. De hecho, no es tampoco un producto retail en el que puedes estar buscando un montón de información. Además, toda la información que tenemos es bastante técnica para cuando quieres empezar a construir. Nosotros adaptamos los mensajes a este perfil de público usuario. Otro tema que tuvimos con el Guardián Constructor es, en el área de comunicaciones principalmente, es que nosotros teníamos una mirada diferente a la que quería el público, el mercado final. Por ejemplo, entonces teníamos por una parte unos mensajes corporativos perfectos para instituciones o posibles aliados y otros completamente diferentes para la parte comercial. Marcar esta línea ha sido un reto bastante complejo en el tema del tiempo, que hoy comienza a dar sus frutos. Tener la claridad de que los mensajes para cada audiencia tienen que ser súper segmentados, saber cómo la audiencia quiere enterarse y consumir la información que tú tienes y sobre todo ver qué es lo que nosotros le podemos dar desde nuestra operación y no qué es lo que nosotros quisiéramos darle. Esa es una diferencia bastante importante que tenemos en el Guardián Constructor. Y por último, la rapidez y el tiempo. Nosotros como comunicadores nos gustaría que todas nuestras piezas, los videos, los flyers, los posts estuviesen listos para ser publicados y ganar un Cannes Lion. Pero la velocidad del mercado en la que nosotros operamos es diferente. Y hoy podemos decir de que priorizamos el contenido y el éxito de nuestros mensajes por encima de que estén listos para participar de algún festival de comunicaciones internacional. El mejor resultado, la mejor campaña es la que tiene éxito frente a cualquier otro contenido. Eso básicamente.
Gracias, Fernando. Aquí tenemos otra pregunta en inglés, es de Diego Limas. Es, how can the organization handle all the social problems of every country with international communication?
So this is one area that having that differentiated structure is really helpful. And I think it's important to remember that, social problems can mean many things. But say we take the example of protests in a country. That will be, if there are protests happening around a specific issue, around a specific law in the US or in Kenya, we won't necessarily hear about it in Peru or in Bangladesh. And so as an international organization, it's really important for us to remember those audiences and be sensitive to the global challenges and the global social problems that are happening. But also recognize that if we spoke about every one of those challenges, especially on our international platforms, it wouldn't be meaningful to the audiences that are on those platforms. So that's part of where having websites for each of the national organizations, having social media accounts for each of those national organizations, and being able to differentiate the messages that go out on each of those platforms is really helpful and important. The assumption there is also that the audience matches the information that will be shared on those national platforms. So when it's specific to a certain country, we tend to use the platforms that align best with the audiences that would care about it. And then it becomes up to the expertise and the experience of the communications manager in that country, whether it is a social problem that aligns with the organization's mission and is something that we are personally equipped and it is appropriate for us to comment on, and where it is not. So for Habitat for Humanity, as an organization, we are much more likely to comment on and to release official statements when the issue relates to housing or when the issue relates to adjacent things like urban development and families. There are times when, for example, in the US, when there were protests last summer around racial justice, that the organization and the senior leadership team evaluated the importance of that issue, how the US audience fits into the global audience, and how the issue of racism fits into our global work. And they determined that it was important and appropriate to release an official statement and respond to that publicly and to state Habitat's position. But audience scale and alignment with our area of work and our space are all really key factors that go into the decision about whether the organization would comment on something. And when the organization as a global entity won't, those same decisions get scaled down to the national level for the national organizations there to evaluate with their national audiences, with their national channels, what to do. And they have access to newsrooms and press release outlets where if they were to comment on something that was nationally based, they could do that in a much more targeted way.
Thank you so much, Ella, and Fernando for. Oh, here is another question, sorry. So, the ability to communicate effectively with our superiors, colleagues, and staff is essential. I know, but does it matter what area of the industry they work in? How workers in the digital age must know how to effectively transmit and receive message in person, as well as by phone, email, and social media.
That's a really important question, not just for us as communications professionals, but for everybody working in this digital age, as the question points out. So when we had that slide with the different teams and that global distribution, I want to flag that I am the only communication staff member currently based in DC. I get the opportunity to work with a couple of other Terwilliger Center colleagues from various different teams, from the microbuild team, for example, and the operations team, for example, in the Washington, DC office. But the Terwilliger Center staff in particular are spread out all around the world. Fernando and I have only met over Zoom and Teams, and we leverage those platforms to stay in touch. We also leverage platforms like WhatsApp and email. I think that, and that's only increasing with the pandemic because, as we all know, many people are not going into the office and staying in touch. So a couple of considerations on that internal communications side, I would say, are making sure you understand the norms of your company. I have worked at companies where WhatsApp was very personal. And if you were sending somebody a WhatsApp message, it was the same as texting them, and it could be misinterpreted as being too personal and being not appropriate. But at the norms of the Terwilliger Center, because we have this global team and this need to be in touch with each other regularly, WhatsApp is part of our norms, and it's a really easy tool in order to be in touch frequently and in order to kind of reach across some of the organizational structure to each other. So I think one of the things to note in adapting to that digital world is that the norms are changing for what is considered appropriate and professional. And that also includes things like, today, I would probably not pick up the phone and call somebody unannounced. Our phones are personal, more so now as compared to when we were all working from offices. And so I'm much more likely to either send a message so someone can be prepared, or to make that call through Teams, which is set up as kind of that technical vehicle. It's also really important when you're doing that cross-cultural communication to recognize that you're not all speaking the same first language. And so you need to have a lot more grace and a lot more forgiveness in when you're reading people's messages. It's important to slow down and stop and reread, because what seems really rude and blunt might be a cultural difference, or it might just be a language difference where the person doesn't have all the same vocabulary to communicate it in a softer way. And I think that that's even more important now that so much of our communications is not face-to-face. You're going to encounter more staff members from other parts of the world who are also operating in an office that has different norms, that has a different sense of humor, that has a different style. And so taking the time and space to slow down will help you be understood better, and it will also help avoid unnecessary conflict, because one of the things doing communications is relationships are so important. And it's really important that you have those relationships not just with your communications colleagues, but also with the programs you support, with the executives who run the programs, with the people on the ground talking with either nonprofit beneficiaries or private sector customers, right? You're going to need to speak to folks, in person and over the digital channels that might not speak the same actual language as you, but might also not speak the same program languages. They might have a different work culture and work language.
Thank you so much, Ellen Fernando, for sharing with us how to make a good communication and also your strategies to make a positive impact. So now, le doy el paso al profesor Alex.
Flavia, gracias nuevamente. Thank you, Ella and Fernando, again for your time, for being here with us. Muchas gracias a ustedes por su tiempo y a todos también por haber participado en esta charla del día de hoy. Les recordamos que la Imagen Week sigue todavía toda esta semana, y el día de mañana a las 2 de la tarde vamos a tener la conferencia Construyendo Confianza y Legitimidad para las Comunidades, Programas de Monitoreo Ambiental Participativo de Plus Petrol, dictada por Sandra Martínez. Ella es la gerente global de responsabilidad social corporativa de Plus Petrol. Así que les comento esto, es el día de mañana a las 2 de la tarde y los esperamos. Gracias a todos por su tiempo y que tengan una buena tarde. Thank you very much and see you again soon. Hasta luego.
Gracias, Silvia. Gracias, Fernando. Gracias a todos. Gracias a todos por participar.